So today we are going to learn a little bit about pollinators, and we're going to talk about their life cycle, because when you know and understand their life cycle, you know how to better protect them in your garden. And then we're going to talk about the importance of native plants and gardening with wildlife in mind. And then at the end, we have some planting suggestions. So if I go over and I zoomed past the garden suggestions, they're on that sheet that you guys will get at home later today. So don't stress, and I'll be here for questions later too. So why are pollinators so important? So pollinators are a huge part of our human food supply. They account for a lot of money in the economy. They do a lot for us. If you haven't heard the term ecosystem services, that's when nature takes care of lots of things we don't think about, we take for granted. They're life-sustaining services that we benefit from. So if you have a tree, obviously a tree gives a lot of wildlife habitats, but it also produces shade and wind barriers. It absorbs thousands of gallons of water every year. So it's those things that we need to start thinking about and appreciating more about nature. So why are pollinators in decline? So it's a multitude of stressors that are all combining. There's pests, there's varroa mite pests for honeybees. There's diseases and funguses that are spreading. We're using way more pesticides now than we used to. There's pollutants, there's nutritional deficiencies. They don't have as much forage material because we don't have as many flowering plants in the ecosystem. We're paving over lots of places. And of course, climate change and the climate variability. Today it's February 16th and it's 60 whatever degrees out. So that variability can bring animals out of hibernation early. They come out, there isn't enough food. It can cause big problems, and it's going to intensify. So we need to help them out. So how are some ways we can help them out? We can buy organic. I try to encourage people to do that, because if you're not buying organic, you are buying food with pesticides, grown with pesticides. Supporting and engaging with your local agriculture is a great way to establish community. You can talk to your farmers about where your food's coming from and what they're doing to help plant for pollinators on their farm. Anytime you can grow your own food is also good, because you're decreasing the amount your food has to travel, you're being more self-sufficient. It's all good. Planting natives, which is of course what we're here to talk about today, is a huge help for pollinators, and it helps hold the ecosystem all together. Please also manage your properties with pollinators in mind. Help spread the word and learn, which is what you guys are all here to do. So the first thing we're going to learn about is our little pollinator friends, because knowledge is power and we want to help protect them. We're going to take a quick second here to go back to elementary school, refresh on pollination. So without pollination, we wouldn't have plants that fruit and flower. The goal of a plant is to make more plants and make seeds. So it creates the fruit to encourage seed dispersal, but in order to get the fruit, it needs to be pollinated. And so it evolved to have flowers to attract pollinators. In Rhode Island, we have butterflies and moths. We have flies. This one on the dandelion is a hoverfly. It's a bee mimic. We also have a variety of bees. That's a honeybee, I think. And hummingbirds and beetles are also pollinators too. In different parts of the world, bats and lizards can help with pollination, but the bats in New England are insectivores, so they don't really care about nectar, so they don't act as pollinators around here, but they're still important to protect. So we're going to focus on one pollinator group first, which is bees. A lot of people think of honeybees when they think of bees. Want to save the bees, save the honeybees. That's important, but there is so much variety in the bee world. There are around nearly 4,000 species of bees in North America, and they're really beautiful to look at. And I'm a big fan. So 90% of bee species are solitary. 75% of them build nests underground, and almost 30% of them are cavity nesters. So I have some pictures of some cavity nesters. So cavities are places like stems. Sometimes they'll dig into your shed and things like that. So this top row is the nesting cells of leafcutter bees. And then underneath that is what's called a cellophane bee. They make like a little barrier between the cells. They make a little loaf of pollen. They lay the egg on top of that for it to nourish itself as it grows and changes. And then on the bottom is a mason bee cell. So that's partitioned with little bits of mud. And sometimes they're with the leafcutter bees, they'll use flowers and they make these beautiful little apartments for their babies. It's very cute. So these cavity nesters are a really important reason for leaving stems in your garden all winter long and then not cleaning up and tidying so much early in the spring. It's really hard to resist because you want to be outside and you want to be gardening. But if you can just leave it and let the plants grow, the little babies will come out. I mean, the queens will come out and they'll do their business. So on the bottom, that is a picture of a ground nest. And so you might see a tiny little hole in the sand in your yard, and that could have bees in it. So they are solitary. Sometimes they have like neighbors. They're semi-social, but they don't have one big colony like honeybees where they're all working together. So ground nesters is an important reason not to spray, not to over fertilize, and to keep tilling and digging to a minimum. If you're familiar with no dig or no till gardening, I believe you have a regenerative Barrington Farm School coming later in the year. You should definitely check them out because regenerative agriculture and no-till methods are very interesting and the way of the future. So we're going to talk a little bit about these honeybees because people love them. They're very cute. But honeybees are more like livestock, is how I think of them. I think of them as like poultry and chickens versus wild bees, which are more of a conservation concern. You have wild birds and raptors, and you have chickens. They're very different. Honeybees and wild bees is the same thing. So right here we have the Bombus gricolis, which is a bumblebee. So we're going to talk about bumblebees in a little bit. And some of them are specialists, which is when they have evolved with one plant to pollinate that singular plant. So at URI, Dr. is, his students are studying bees, and they found 6 of the bumblebee species in Rhode Island. There used to be 11 historically. There is also a DEM citizen science project going on this year that I encourage you to check out. I have the link in that handout, and they're using the Bird Atlas grid system. So they put a big grid over the whole state, and you go once a month and check for bumblebees and you learn to ID them and catch them and stuff. It sounds like a lot of fun. Sounds like quite an adventure I'm gonna do this year. There's a training for that at the beginning of March. So in Massachusetts, there are 12 species, but 5 are at risk. So here are some bumblebees. This is a bumblebee species from England, this picture, but they have a very different kind of system than a different life cycle than you might think. The queen comes, she mates in the fall, in the spring, summer, one of those months, summer, and then she goes into hibernation. And then she comes out early in the spring because bumblebees come out earlier than other bees because they're so big and fuzzy, they can handle the different temperature variability. So they're very fuzzy, they have little jackets on, which makes them prone to overheating, which is a problem in climate change times. So then she collects pollen, and that pollen stimulates the ovaries to lay the eggs. And then she makes a little bee bread, it's called. It's a little loaf of bread, and she lays the larvae on it, and she sits on top of it. So she almost incubates it like a bird. They have a little bare patch on their belly, just like some birds do. And she creates these little honey pots out of wax. And so she can just stay on her larvae and get honey for some energy. And they're very cute. I think they're very sweet little honey pots. I just wanted to include that. Most gardeners tend to remove their nesting sites. They like old rodent burrows and those little grassy things that you might clear away to show off your nice plants. That's perfect habitat for bumblebee queens. So just be messier. So if we want to help bees and all the other pollinators, we need to have a paradigm shift. We need to change our perspective. And instead of thinking about, oh, this is my garden, This is my garden. What pleases me? What do I like to look at? We need to think about our garden as a habitat and look at the whole ecosystem that we are tending to temporarily. If any of you have inherited gardens, um, you can inherit some invasive plants that become the bane of your existence. So I can encourage you all to leave behind some habitat and look at your garden that way. We need to think about gardens as places for complete life cycles, not just flowers in the summer. You know, there's a whole system of life going on when you are not using your garden. We need to stop just gardening for the humans and start gardening for all the other critters that make that place their home. So when we're gardening for wildlife, we need to think about the different things that wildlife need. We need plant diversity. We need food. They need a water source. They need a place to stay. They need shelter, right? And host plants, which I will discuss later. So diversity of plants could include different plant types like evergreen, perennials, annuals. It could be the shape of the plant. So if you have an evergreen, that's great shelter for birds. We'll talk more about that in a second. But and leaf litter is also another shelter. So here I have a picture of a willow flower on this side. I could do this. There we go. So the willow is one of the earlier blooms that's really important for queen bumblebees when they come out of hibernation. And here we have milkweed, right? Everyone probably knows this plant by now. So I recently learned that butterflies use visual cues to find the milkweed. So if you have a whole dense plot of milkweed, they're not going to find it. They're not going to be able to see that as milkweed. So that's why milkweed, you'll see it pop up one over here and one over here. I had a mulched spot and I found all these little tiny milkweed and I found 24 little eggs laid on them, even though they were this big. And I had huge ones that had no eggs on them. So I think it was because they were visually prominent. Adding trees and shrubs and ground cover and vines are all part of planting with diversity in mind. The other thing about this is penstemon. And so this is great for long-tongued bumblebees because the flower is shaped in a different way. So the bumblebee has to get all the way in there. You need to use their long tongue to get that nectar. And then of course they're pollinating the plant while they do that. It's one of my favorites. A water source. You don't have to install a pond in your garden. I do not have space for that. I know it's a very expensive thing. You can just have some bird baths. You can have puddles. You can have soggy areas of moss. They will drink from the moss. Bees will. If you have a shallow body of water like a bird bath, it's important that you keep it clean and that you refresh it on super hot days. Like last July when we had that huge long drought and all that hot weather, that water would get so hot. And if you're a tiny little bee and you drink really hot water, it's not going to be good for you. And there are some plants that you can plant that hold water in the leaves, which is also an interesting way to think about it. So shelter. We have lots of varieties to choose from. You could keep some logs, you can keep the stems, you can have a compost. Queen bumblebees love to nest near composts. I think it might have to do with the temperature, might have to do with the fact that it doesn't get touched so much. Leaving your leaves in the fall and leaving them all winter is good for pollinators and all insects because there are little critters hiding in all that leaf litter. Having some bare soil is also beneficial for those ground nesters. They don't want to dig through the grass. They can't do that. They're not going to do that. They like the sandy soil. There are different species that like clay soils and things like that, but most of the times they want to be able to dig into it pretty easily. I have mature trees on both sides of this for insects and for birds and mammals, and that is to encourage you to save the trees on your property for as long as you can. You can find information on managing snags because just the ecosystem services that mature trees provide is important, and it's pretty impressive. Birds and mammals, having shrubs and evergreens allows them to feel safe. They'll come to your feeder if you have a bird feeder near a shrub, they're more likely to use it than if you have it in the middle of your grass lawn. That's because it makes them feel safe. They know that if a hawk comes by, they can hide. So that's an important thing to think about, especially with evergreens over the winter when everything's bare and exposed. If you have room for meadows or grasslands, that's fantastic. If you work with other properties that are bigger than your own, encourage them to plant for pollinators in their meadows. Young trees are also good. We also want to plant more trees. And rock walls are habitats that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but they house lots of rodents and snakes. And why I always tell kids not to climb on the rock walls, because you could be crushing somebody's house and you just don't know. So we talked about plant diversity, water sources, and shelter. And we are going to switch gears and talk about food, and which they get their food from the plants. And we're going to be talking about host plants. Before we talk about host plants, we need to talk about Lepidoptera. The Lepidoptera is butterflies and moths. There are over 14,000 species of moth and butterfly in North America. There are 59 species of butterfly in Rhode Island and 423 species of moth in Rhode Island. About 6 to 11% of that whole Lepidoptera family is butterflies. And moths are diurnal, meaning they come out during the day too. And I think some people forget that. Those cabbage moths. So a host plant is a plant that evolved with an insect species. The insect relies on that plant for its life cycle. So plants evolved, they don't want to get eaten, so they're not very tasty. They have lots of chemicals in them that make them taste bitter or sticky, unpleasant. So the milkweed is a perfect example of a host plant. It's not tasty. The caterpillar ingests it and it becomes very gross and disgusting, and the birds spit it out and then they learn not to eat that later on in their life. They spent thousands and thousands of years evolving together. So if you do not have the host plants, you will not get the insect species. So I think thinking about it that way helps people understand the importance of planting natives. So here is an example of a host plant that I love that we have in the garden at Audubon. This is northern spicebush. And the garden, we have trained it to look like trees. It can kind of get kind of shrubby, but you can prune it to look like a tree. And we've made little tunnels out of it, which is a nice, cool place to explore in the summer. It has these beautiful little yellow flowers, and it makes it a great substitute, native substitute for forsythia, because forsythia is not native and it gets very aggressive and it just takes over. So northern spicebush also has these beautiful little red berries. They're hard to see though, because they get eaten very quickly. The birds love them. And if you have a northern spicebush, you will get a spicebush swallowtail with these crazy looking caterpillars. And sometimes they're different colors. They're not always green like this. Sometimes they're purpley or orange colored. So now we're going to talk about native plants. So let's talk about some vocabulary, because if you're just starting out learning about native plants, it can get kind of intimidating and confusing. Vocabulary is great, but it can be kind of daunting. So if you're endemic, it means that you're native to a place. There are lots of endemic species on islands. They evolved there. They don't go traveling around. You have a non-native plant. Here I have some petunias. Those are from another place in the world, but they're not going to cause problems. They're going to just sit where you plant them. They'll grow, they'll die, they'll be happy. You'll be happy. So invasive plants. This is mugwort, if anybody's familiar with it. Mugwort is very aggressive. It is not from America, and it spreads by rhizomes under the soil. I went to a talk where they talked about removing it, and they did consecutive circles. They had goats come in, mow it down, and they dug troughs of concentric circles to stop it from growing, and they put plastic on top of it and then soil on top of it. They still had a problem with it, because when you evolve in a place, you have other species that are going to keep you in check. When you come to a new place, you can just take over. The deer don't want to eat you, so you get to do whatever you want. If you've heard, we are in ecoregion 59. The ecoregion is just a way of categorizing where your native plants are. Some of the plants in these slides are not native to Rhode Island specifically. Some people will get very strict about that. They like to have plants that are, the seeds are from Rhode Island and they don't want to talk about anybody else. That's fine. I think that it's important to be flexible in these changing times. Maybe planting some mid-Atlantic plants will help those pollinators as they travel or migrate, hopefully. So this is trout lily, this yellow flower. This yellow flower. So why do we love native plants? They are beautiful. They have lots of genetic diversity. Within those seeds, there's thousands of years of evolution. We don't know what the good stuff is in there, and we should trust nature to do what it does. There's a lot of biodiversity that we can't account for. People like to mess with plants. It's impressive. They have so much genetic diversity. Did you guys know that all of these vegetables are from the same species of plants? Brassica oleracea, probably saying it wrong, because yeah, has 24 unique varieties of vegetables consumed by humans. So this is an example of human breeding. But if you just look at the genetic diversity that is within that plant, it can give you an idea of what the opportunities are for native plants in our gardens. We do this with all things. We do it with our pets. That's why pugs look so strange. And we like to breed things and make them look a certain way. So natives in your garden. I am going to encourage you to make the use of your space by planting woody ornamentals and perennials. That way you don't have to be making annual plots every year, which is nice. Bedding plants are fine, but they have a space. So this is a list of plants from Dr. Jagir at UMass Dartmouth. Those early pollen sources I think are important to highlight. Those bumblebee queens come out in the cold days of March or April, maybe February, I don't know. So it's important that they have that pollen to feed their larvae and stimulate the ovaries to lay the eggs. So with woody ornamentals, you get the most bang for your buck. It's an investment, but you get shelter, you get food, you get flowers and pollen and nectar. This is Amelanchier or shadbush. Sometimes it's called Juneberry. It's got lots of different names. They call it shadbush because when it bloomed, the shad were running. There's also serviceberry. There's all sorts of interesting folklore about the names of plants. So a keystone plant is a plant that supports a lot of diversity. It holds the ecosystem together, kind of like a beaver does for an ecosystem. A beaver can make a whole ecosystem with its tail. These trees are doing the same things. This red maple in my yard, that's mine, I own. There are 300 species of Lepidoptera that use red maples. And this tree can reach heights of 60 feet. Obviously, it's not for everyone's garden. But, and as I said before, mature trees can absorb up to 4,000 gallons of water annually. So when the floods come, it's important to have some trees. And I just thought this picture of the little helicopters was so cute. I've never seen them that tiny, little baby. So in that top picture is the little helicopters that you stick on your nose from the maple tree when you're a kid. And that's the maple flower. And if you're a honeybee farmer, you know that the maple trees are one of the first flushes of flowers that help you with your honeybee flow. So for some small trees, for smaller gardens, there's beach plum. Beach plum grows near the beach. So it's really great for areas that get a lot of salt and a lot of dry weather. They get a lot of wind. They're pretty sturdy plants. They support 400 species of moth and butterfly. I have never tried beach plums fresh, but I've had beach plum jam, which is delicious. And they're a small tree, so they're great for gardens. This one's a little bit bigger. This is a black cherry. They're medium-sized trees. They're also a keystone species because they support so many species of Lepidoptera. At mature height, it's 45 feet tall, and the branches can go 25 feet wide. And they're very beautiful little inconspicuous flowers and fruits, and they don't make a big mess. I have one. So some herbaceous perennials, things that die down every year and come back. They put on all their growth in 1 year. That is Monarda, or bee balm, everybody's favorite. So Monarda is a host species for 9 species of butterfly, which is important. And it's different to be a host species than just supporting plants. But so this yellow flower is Baptisia. and it is the host plant for the frosted elfin moth that you see here. That plant is a sundial lupine. That's not a baptisia leaf, but baptisia are really pretty. I think they can be used in floral bouquets as an alternative to eucalyptus. They have that same kind of glaucous bluish tint to them. I think they're very pretty. So perennials are great because they add a variety of height and form and floral shapes, and you have a variety of colors to choose from. Here is a list of spring flowering species. Keep talking about spring because we have a lot of flowering fall plants that just kind of come up on their own, goldenrod. But with the spring varieties, spring species, you really need to be specific about planting them. I don't see them that often. So we have here, this is Tiarella in this picture, which is foam flower. Sometimes I remember the Latin name and sometimes I remember the common name. So I switch back and forth. Golden groundsel is a great plant. It has beautiful little yellow flowers, bursts of color in the beginning of spring. There are a lot of phloxes to choose from that provide a lot of nice pastels. And red bud, which is on the next slide, and it has this beautiful flush of pink. It's kind of flashy for some, but I think it's a really fun color. And this is actually in the pea family, so it fixes nitrogen also. I'm not really sure how that works in the taxonomy. The big scientists like to categorize things, but if you look up close, it has little pea-shaped flowers. This is another one I decided to highlight. This is Claytonia. It's a spring beauty. This has a bee specialist. There is one species of bee that likes to pollinate this. So if you are interested in planting for pollinators, you get extra bonus points if you plant for the specialist because the generalist will also use them for pollen and nectar. This is a picture I took that I just wanted to show off. I thought it was a really cool special. So this is agastache. We have a lot of this in the pollinator garden at Audubon. And there's a lot of plants on this summer list that you're probably familiar with. Joe Pyeweed is next. Joe Pyeweed is one of my new favorites too. It's got lots of tiny little flowers, and that makes it fantastic for pollinators. They'll dance on that all day. And it gets very tall. But there are some that are also short. And it likes to grow in the shade. I don't know. I think it's a great, and I've been impressed with where it will grow. It says that it likes to grow in part shade and have its feet wet, but I grow it in a very dry area in the sun, and it does just fine. So it's always worth a shot. This is cardinal flower, which is just stunning. If you have any wet areas of your garden, it's worth trying to plant this gorgeous one. So what to plant and where to find it. If you want more plant lists, I would check out these sites. Doug Tallamy's work has a fantastic comprehensive list in the back, separated by region. I would also recommend checking out the National Wildlife Federation plant list. And the Xerxes Society has a lot of land management materials for bigger projects too. And they have small plant lists as well. Plants and seeds, these are local places. Some in Connecticut, some in Massachusetts, some right around the corner. And then there are also local organizations which you can help support, which I know some of you are a part of, and appreciate supporting these places that are doing the hard work of collecting and saving those precious seeds and putting them out into the ecosystem. So what can you do in your garden? So you can avoid pesticides. That makes a lot of sense, right? You can grow native plants. You can grow your own food. There's also a squash bee, which I grow squashes just for the squash bee because they're very cute. They have little white and black stripes on the abdomen. Yeah, head, thorax, abdomen. Let's do the little song in my head. We do head, shoulders, knees, and toes. We do head, thorax. Yeah, so they pollinate. They evolved with the squash plants in North America, and they have a little special bond. And like we said before, supporting the full life cycle of plants, having those host species, having a water source, making sure you're not destroying the shelters that they need, and focusing on keystone plants. And be the change, because I like puns. So leaving the stems, managing your property for pollinators is half the battle, more than half the battle, because we have gardeners, we want to get involved, we want to touch things, we want to get in there, we want to clean things up and make it look nice. But if we can just slow down and say, nope, I'm not going to do that for a couple weeks. That can be there for the birds or the bees. And it creates it's a huge help. It feels like you're not doing anything, so it makes you stressed out, but that's cool. If your neighbors start to give you any side eye, I encourage you to talk to them. You can also have a sign like this. There's signs for sale from all organizations, and it kind of helps passersby understand why you're not going for that neat and tidy look in case you have any problems. I encourage you to talk to your HOA, maybe host a conversation about the landscaping practices that are being used on your properties or in your neighborhoods. Because this is the way forward, we need to be able to talk to each other about these things and make these connections so that we can be the change and make a difference. In the spring, yes, so they say to wait until you have a whole week over 50 degrees at night before you start to get in there, which it feels very late when you've been inside all winter. But there's other things we can do. We can plant trees. And joining a garden club like the one here. You guys have a great garden. There's two here. Two in Barrington. What are they called? Hamahoe Garden Club and Barrington Garden Club. Barrington also has a beautiful land trust, and the pollinator pathway people are going to be talking later in the series. So make sure to go to that. And here is one of the books that I mentioned. Doug Tallamy is a entomologist from University of Delaware, I believe, and his books are very comprehensive and very dense. Highly recommended. I don't know how many copies, if you have copies at this library, but I recommend it. There's two. He also has talks online. If you decide to go talk to your HOA, you might be able to have a viewing of one of his talks and encourage other people to change their perspective.